Good evening, everyone, and welcome to CHES's second event of Holocaust Education Month, our second generation program featuring a keynote address by Helen Epstein. I know there are a lot of familiar faces joining us tonight, many who joined for our opening event on Tuesday. So glad to have you back and very pleased to say hello to some new people tonight as well. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Abigail Beeman, and I'm a reporter with Global National based here in our Ottawa bureau. I'm also honored to be a director with CHES, the Center for Holocaust Education and Scholarship. Tonight would not be possible without the support of some generous sponsors and partners. A very deep thank you to those whose names you see on your screens right now. We are holding tonight's event in honor of Dr. Truda Rosenberg. Truda Rosenberg was born in a Polish village in 1922. She recorded her survival story in her book, Unmasked. It documents the horrors she witnessed and the heroic bravery that kept her alive. Her entire family was killed in the Holocaust. After the liberation of the camps, her command of several languages facilitated her work as an interpreter for the British Army before she trained as a nurse in England. Truda next immigrated to Canada, and in Ottawa, she met her husband, Imre Rosenberg. She earned a PhD in psychology and opened a private practice. Truda was an active member of the Shoah Committee for many years and among the first group of survivors in Ottawa to share her survival story at educational institutions. Today, Truda is 99 years old and lives at Hillel Lodge. We're thinking of her tonight. I know we're all looking forward to hearing from Helen Epstein. I need to run through a few quick housekeeping notes for you first. First of all, your audio has been muted and your videos have been turned off, except of course for our speakers tonight. Helen Epstein will be taking questions, and you can use the Q&A feature, which you'll find in the black control strip at the bottom of your screen. Submit a question whenever you have one, and I will moderate that session at the end. A reminder, the Q&A should just be for questions. If you have any comments, feel free to leave them in the chat at the bottom of your screen. If you have any technical difficulties, we have a tech support team to help, and you can use that same chat box to let them know any issues. Finally, one important note, Giving Tuesday is coming up November 30th. Please consider making a difference, support the fight against anti-Semitism, and help keep the memory of the Holocaust alive. Specifically this year, CHES is raising funds to create a virtual memorial for Canadian Holocaust survivors, the first of its kind. You'll hear more on that from Mina in just a moment. And if you donate on Giving Tuesday, we're very pleased to share the first $20,000 in donations will be matched by an anonymous donor, so you could see your support doubled. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce our chair for some welcoming words tonight. Welcome to Mina Cohen.
Thank you, Abigail. Good evening and welcome to the Shadows of the Holocaust on the Lives of Children of Survivors. Is it possible to move beyond the grip? CHES 2021 Program for Descendants of Survivors. I want to extend a warm welcome to the survivors who have joined us, to the children and grandchildren of the survivors, to our keynote speaker, Helen Epstein, to our special guest, Haim and Lawrence Greenspoon. Welcome all. The world around us is changing. The spike of anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, and distortion is alarming. Modern day anti-Semitism needs our urgent attention. It is our responsibility as children of survivors and as Jews to confront any and all displays of hatred through education and activism. CHES is mandated to develop educational programs that promote knowledge and understanding of the history and legacy of the Holocaust. We believe that more and better Holocaust education is the best response to counterattack these terrible developments, and we strive to create better tools and strategies to explore the lessons of the Holocaust. For the benefit of the many guests who join us this evening, within Canada and abroad, I would like to share some information about the Center for Holocaust Education and Scholarship. CHES was inaugurated in 2015. Since then, our growth has been remarkable, reaching thousands within the Ottawa area and beyond. I'm pleased to share that in January 2021, we launched a new chapter in the life of CHES. CHES now operates as independent, registered charity dedicated to addressing the pressing challenges of growing anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, and distortion. Our themes, our focus on education, our programming have not changed. To the contrary, they have been strengthened. The strength of CHES continues to lie in its dedicated committee and the community support for our work. CHES programs are offered in cooperation with embassies, institutions in Ottawa, and organizations across the country and overseas, and include the annual Holocaust Education Month programs in November, which feature events such as tonight's event, outreach to schools, the annual Teachers Workshop, Speakers Bureau, lectures, and more. We are gathered here tonight to learn and share more about issues of interest to us, children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. We, the children of Holocaust survivors, are in a privileged position, as Elie Wiesel once said when speaking about descendants of Holocaust survivors. They, he said, who did not go through the experience must transmit it. And so it is our responsibility to navigate how we share our intimate knowledge of the Holocaust with others. Some of us write, others dedicate themselves to Holocaust research, others engage in artistic expression or education. I too am a child of survivors, and my choice has been involvement in Holocaust education for over 30 years. And it continues to be a rewarding experience for me. I invite you to join our effort as members of CHES or by supporting our organization. CHES is about to embark on a new and vital project that will be of interest to all of you and to which we hope you will contribute your family's stories. The project, the lasting virtual memorial for Holocaust survivors who made Canada their home, will live permanently online and will offer a unique opportunity to honor Holocaust survivors who made Canada their home, create a needed Canadian historical record for Holocaust research, a record that doesn't exist to date, and serve as a resource for fighting anti-Semitism and Holocaust distortion. All funds received during this year's Giving Tuesday will support this project. Third generation of Holocaust survivors will be playing an important role in the way future generations understand the Holocaust. Engaging them today is still a challenge, and CHES is looking for creative ways to attract them to our work. Tonight's program includes such an effort. We are pleased to have with us Haim, a grandchild of survivors, who will provide a short but important observation. On behalf of CHES, I would like to express our appreciation and thanks to the Second Generation Event Subcommittee, which worked tirelessly for many months to bring these important programs to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Mina. And as you heard from Mina, next we will welcome Haim Cates. Haim finished his studies as a graduate and undergraduate at the University of Toronto. One of his primary goals is to advocate for students on campus. Much of that advocacy drew him into Jewish student life roles and saw him collaborating with various Jewish groups both on and off campus. Haim is the grandson of a Holocaust survivor and understands the dangers of anti-Semitism left unchecked. He will share some of his personal experiences and insights with us tonight. Welcome, Haim.
Thank you very much, Miss Beeman. Thank you to Ms. Cohen and the Center for Holocaust Education and Scholarship for inviting me here tonight. I am honored to be able to present to you a bit of my story this evening, and also to hear from Ms. Epstein. I want to start my story with a historical joke I have heard. Two friends are walking down the street. One happened to have kyphosis, which is sometimes known as having a hunchback. So for the purposes of historical accuracy, I will use that term. As they walked past a synagogue, the man turned to his friend with kyphosis and said, "You know, I used to be a Jew." His friend looked at him and said, "Yeah, and I used to be a hunchback." This story is critical to my story this evening. My name is Haim, and I have attended the University of Toronto, and I'm currently studying at the University of Calgary. But I am just one student. I have worked with any Jewish organization that supports our community and me, but I am just me. However, the stories and sentiments I share today, although varied, have occurred to thousands of students on campus around Canada. We are struggling and we need your help and to know what we are going through. I grew up in Calgary, Alberta, where the small Jewish community came together for significant events. I was a member of the Orthodox and conservative schools, attended summer camp with Chabad, went to Jewish day schools, and attended youth groups by all observance levels. I have heard the worst that anti-Semitism can do from my Zeta, who is a Holocaust survivor, as well as my own trip to see Auschwitz. I have seen the scratches on the walls, I have seen the graves, and I have seen the tears in my Zeta's eyes as he told me his story, and told me to never to hate, to forgive, but never forget. Anti-Semitism has always existed around me, from being the only Jewish student to wear a kippah in a public high school, to missing sports on Saturdays. I was the bulk of many comments. Although I experienced anti-Semitism in my community, it was terrifying how pronounced it was when I came to the university campus, a space that is supposed to be tolerant and open. In my experience at U of T, I have been a constant advocate for the Jewish community and the right to our self-determination. I have heard from students who have been direct attacks of anti-Semitism, whether it be throwing money or being made to feel unsafe, wearing a kippah or any Jewish symbol on campus. My student union, which is supposed to represent my needs, forced us to pay fees into the boycott, divestment, sanction movement. They have also put on many events and initiatives that have marginalized and infringed on the safety of Jewish students, including even inviting a former member of the PFLP, a designated terrorist organization by this government. These actions create a toxic environment where many Jews do not feel safe going to our meetings or even to discuss our own representation. There are many other instances at U of T which I could delve into of clear anti-Semitism. This is not just targeting Jews, but anybody who tries to allies with Jews on campus. This is not a U of T phenomenon. It is a campus-wide, Canada-wide, and global problem. Just listen to these recent 5 headlines over the last few months. Students return to campus along with anti-Semitism. Not just neo-Nazis with tiki torches, why Jewish students say they fear cloaked anti-Semitism. 43% of Jewish US university students witnessed anti-Semitism. A third of US Jews changed behavior due to anti-Semitism. Jews are under siege on campuses and in college towns. Where's the outrage? Where are the intellectuals? With COVID-19 and the pandemic, our Jewish students have been more isolated, being attacked on social media. With the recent conflict in Israel, it was not sparking a new fire of anti-Semitism. It was simply putting fuel on already burning embers. It's become socially acceptable to hate Jews. It's almost socially encouraged. Look no further than Mark Zuckerberg posting a picture of his dog wearing a kippah with the Star of David, and in turn was attacked with anti-Semitic and anti-Israel comments. Non-Jewish actors like Eddie Marsan have received anti-Semitic attacks for playing Jewish characters. Think about that. It's not even safe to act as a Jew. Over my life, I have been observant and secular, kept kosher and eaten out, but there are 2 fast days I have always kept. In addition to Yom Kippur, I fast on Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is the most intense day of mourning in the Jewish calendar. It's the morning of many events in our history, which include the destruction of the Jewish temples in Jerusalem, an original dispersion of our communities, the expulsion of Jews from Spain, and the discussion of the final plan to destroy Jews in Europe. That's just to name a few. I constantly hear people say Jews in Israel should just return to their homes. What home? Jews are scattered all over the world because we've been kicked out of every place we have ever lived, including our original homeland. Should I go back to Europe where my Zeta was almost killed? Should I stay in Canada where anti-Semitism is so rife that there are legitimate conversations with people my age about when we will have to leave? The time for action is now. People need education, not just about the atrocities of the Holocaust, but Canada's role or lack thereof in helping Jews and other marginalized communities. We need to learn from our past, or we are doomed to repeat it. I will leave you with this final note. Typically, when you join new groups, they do icebreaker introduction games. A typical one is, give us a word or top 3 words that describe or define you. Being a Jew has always been on that list for me. I have been told by friends in universities and acquaintances that anti-Semitism is not as bad as other discriminatory acts because Jews can pass. They can take off their symbols. They can remove their kippahs. Let me tell you, Jews are from all around the world, and having a Jewish identifier symbol did not matter in the Holocaust or any other persecution of our people, and will not matter moving forward to those who wish to oppress us. Just like the individual with the hunchback, we will always be Jews. We need to unify and create a space where students can feel safe and express their pride as a Jew. We are down a dangerous path, and I hope that we can avoid or reverse from here. A fundamental step is to continue to pass down the knowledge of what happened in the Holocaust, including the years preceding it, as well as other discriminatory atrocities in human history. We must never forget. Events like these and the initiatives of CHES are what will allow us to move forward and continue to educate. We are going to universities to learn, not to fight anti-Semitism. Thank you for inviting me here tonight and letting me share just a bit of my story. But I am just one student. Thank you for your time. Merci beaucoup and toda rabah.
Haim, thank you so much for being so open and honest and sharing such important insights. It's so important that we hear insights like yours, and we were very pleased to include your voice this evening. Thank you. I'm now very pleased to introduce our keynote speaker. Helen Epstein is an arts journalist and author or translator of 10 books, including the unique nonfiction trilogy, Children of the Holocaust, Where She Came From, and The Long Half-Lives of Love and Trauma. Most recently, during the pandemic, Epstein edited and annotated her mother's memoir, Francie's War, published in 9 countries. Epstein's work on the intergenerational transmission of trauma has been pioneering and groundbreaking. It paved the way for hundreds of works by second-generation writers, artists, and researchers, and has been widely translated. Born in Prague in 1947, Helen grew up in New York City, and while an undergrad at Hebrew University, was caught in the 1968 Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. The Jerusalem Post printed her first-person account and launched her journalism career. Her reviews and articles have appeared in the Sunday New York Times, Washington Post, Boston Globe, New York Times Magazine, Esquire, and NewYorker.com. She lives in Massachusetts and has 2 grandchildren in Montreal. A very warm welcome to Helen Epstein.
Well, thank you so much, Abigail and Mina. And Haim, I was really moved by your talk, and I wish I could respond with a talk that addresses your concerns. And this is not my area of expertise. It is the area of expertise of a close friend of mine, of Deborah Lipstadt, who is being appointed right now by President Biden to be a kind of anti-Semitism ambassador to different places in the United States. But I certainly, your talk has made me really want to follow this more closely. So let me move to the subject of my talk tonight, which is the shadow of the Holocaust. Is it possible to move beyond its grip? The shadow of the Holocaust has been with me, as it has been for many of you, all my life. I'm the daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors, 2 sole survivors of their families. And my mother had an Auschwitz tattoo on her forearm that I saw from the moment I was born. As I've written in my books, that tattoo disturbed me so profoundly that for a very long time, I could not remember its numbers. As I wrote in my first book, Children of the Holocaust, I was also haunted by Holocaust iconography: trains, chimneys, smoke, barbed wire, yellow stars. I traced the beginning of my consciously thinking about the intergenerational aspect of historical trauma to my university years in Israel. In 1967, I became one of the thousands of mitnadvim, or volunteers, from all over the world who planned to work in the places of soldiers who had been mobilized for the Six-Day War. The war ended very quickly, and hundreds of us wound up earning undergraduate degrees at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. I believe the majority of them were children of Holocaust survivors. We were bi or trilingual, bi or tricultural. Our families had been displaced to other European countries or to North or South America, Asia, Australia, or Africa. I wasn't a journalist yet, but I wasn't shy about asking people questions, people who seemed to have some of the same features and preoccupations that I had. I thought of us foreigners as well as Israelis with parents who had emigrated as survivors after the Holocaust. I thought of us as a peer group without a sign. I started a novel that I titled We Who Came After the War. That experience in Israel from 1967 to 70 my research became what was known as research into the second generation over 50 years ago. I'm now older than my grandparents, mother, and father were when they died. Over the past 5 decades, my hunch that history, culture, resilience, and trauma had been passed on from one generation to another has given rise to hundreds of books and works of art, as well as research studies in such fields as neuroscience and biochemistry. Many of those books and studies, including mine, have been used by other groups interested in the intergenerational transmission of trauma, such as Armenians, Rwandans, Cambodians, African Americans, and Native Americans, or what you in Canada call Indigenous people. Providing a framework and words for so many people's experience is an author's dream and deeply gratifying. But it has taken me a very long time to be able to fully understand the dimensions of the long shadow of the Shoah. Like you, I've wondered, does anyone ever move beyond its grip? My answer is yes and no. It depends on if and how you address your history and to what extent you believe in the relative importance of genes, family, culture, psychotherapy, and new research in epigenetics and neuroscience. I myself am skeptical of the epigenetic and neuroscientific research so far. I think the studies have been too small and not optimally designed. But as a reader and as a person who finds solace in art, I am very interested in the ever-growing body of art and literature of Holocaust survivors and their descendants, including their letters, diaries, books, films, paintings, music, and testimonies. Contemporary researchers often cite 3 ways of working through trauma: talking about it, writing about it, and working with people who have been traumatized. When people ask me if and how I have moved beyond the shadow, I say, yes, I have, and I describe some of these 3 ways. But first, let's examine what has been termed the shadow of the Holocaust. In my case, my parents, both Prague citizens of Czechoslovakia, were both deported to Terezin, then to Auschwitz, then to labor camps, where both of them performed slave labor. They were both sole survivors of their family. There is no doubt that I grew up with people traumatized by the war, but it was in my parents' view a war that had traumatized their entire country, not only its Jews. My parents were loyal Czechoslovak citizens who did not go to DP camps, but who returned to Prague after liberation. They had first met long before the war, when my mother was 13 and my father, her 29-year-old swim coach. In June of 1946, after the war, they ran into one another on a Prague street. Francie was by then a 26-year-old fashion designer and a widow. My father, Kurt, was a national champion in water polo and a 41-year-old bachelor. They made a date at the swim club and moved in together 24 hours later. Fast, even by survivor standards. They were very, very different, a provincial jock and an urban sophisticate, but they married as soon as they could obtain papers in December of 1946. I was born in November of 1947 and would have grown up in Prague had it not been for the communist coup of February 1948. 3 years after my parents returned from the war, while I was still a baby, we left Czechoslovakia with the proverbial 3 suitcases. In those suitcases were diapers and precious family photographs and objects that had been saved for my father by his non-Jewish water polo teammates, and for my mother by her non-Jewish fashion customers. The Epsteins became part of New York's Czech survivor community that included both Jews and non-Jewish survivors, anti-Nazi and anti-communist refugees. The community was politically and socially liberal. My Czech, non-Jewish nanny had hidden a Jewish child in Prague while her husband was a political prisoner for 6 years. Other Czechs we knew had been in or aided the Czech resistance. They all talked about the trauma of the war, and I grew up hearing the names Heydrich and Lidice. Heydrich was the Nazi commander of the Czech Protectorate, who was assassinated by members of the Czech resistance. Hitler retaliated for his assassination by razing the town of Lidice to the ground, shooting all its men, and relocating and re-educating all of its children in German schools. A reign of terror followed for all Czechs. So the widespread trope of silence about the war was not part of my experience, and my impression of physical and psychological damage from the Shoah was not restricted to Jewish adults. However, near silence about the war was what I experienced outside my home in American and American Jewish culture of the 1950s. I grew up on the west side of Manhattan in a largely American Jewish neighborhood. At the 50th reunion of my grammar school class, almost everyone remembered the tattoo on my mother's forearm and also being told by their parents not to stare at it. Tattoos were associated with prisoners and sailors then, though my classmates were told by their parents that the Epsteins had been, as people then said, in the camps. Those who read Children of the Holocaust were surprised to discover continuing behavioral aspects of the Holocaust shadow, that my mother was suicidal and that my father was given to sudden rages. They were unaware that I had no grandparents or other close family to visit. The dichotomy between our intimate family world and the outside world continued through my high school years. One reason for that was language. While the ramifications of the war pervaded everything in our household, they were rarely translated from Czech into English. Another reason was culture. I was raised as an immigrant child with different standards and rules than American children. My parents and their friends behaved in ways that American parents did not. They had different expectations around food, friendship, sexuality, civil rights, justice, loyalty to family and friends. And they had a toleration of behavior bordering on the insane. Early on, I came to think that being Czech was culturally very different from being American. Only later did I formulate the thought that surviving the war seemed to give survivors a blank check for all kinds of behavior. Another reason for the disconnect in knowledge between my private world and the outside culture was that my parents did not usually socialize with Americans. They did not attend PTA or any other kind of parent-teacher meetings or synagogue services. Once a year on Yom Kippur, they attended a Bnei B'rith refugee Yizkor service in honor of their parents. They were allergic to anything official. I was unaware of 2Gs who participated in New York youth groups attached to such survivor organizations as the Bergen-Belsen Association or the Warsaw Ghetto Resistance Organization. Although a few second-generation artists and writers developed their work in the contexts of these groups, most of them, people like Eva Hoffman and Anne Karp in the United Kingdom, Nava Semel and Savion Liebrecht in Israel, Art Spiegelman, Lev Raphael, Sonia Pilzer, Melvin Bukiet, and Thane Rosenbaum in the United States, Henrik Broder and Aliana Brodmann in Germany, did so in relative isolation. Unlike in today's schools, children and teenagers in the 1950s and early 60s were rarely asked to construct family trees, and there was little public discussion then of the Shoah. However, I was fortunate to grow up surrounded by Jews on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. I didn't realize then that I belonged to a small minority. Many of my teachers and role models were Jews, Many New York journalists, Broadway actors and playwrights, musicians, and the conductor of the New York Philharmonic, Leonard Bernstein, were outspoken Jews. Moreover, I attended a public high school for gifted girls, where many of the students were daughters of Jewish refugees. That school made me believe that I had a voice and a right to use it. Another essential factor in my becoming conscious of my own history was the writer James Baldwin and the African American civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s. So many of its themes, slave labor, imprisonment, murder, ghettoization, racism, applied to my parents' experience under Nazism. This was apparent almost every evening in the 1950s when I watched desegregation efforts on the television news with my parents. My upbringing as a daughter of survivors primed me not only to study in Israel, but also to return to my birthplace of Prague as soon as I could. I did so in August of 1968, when I was caught in the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia on my way home to New York City. I wrote an eyewitness account and was offered a reporter's job at the Jerusalem Post when I returned. After graduating, I went to journalism graduate school and eventually became an author of nonfiction books. In the 1970s, in addition to working on a novel about members of the second generation, I wrote about us for small Jewish magazines such as Midstream, Present Tense, and the National Jewish Monthly. I also had begun freelancing for the Times and pitched my second generation idea to my editors. They were skeptical. How did I know a second generation existed? Did second generation have an organization, letterhead? Could experts vouch for their importance? Finally, because Time magazine ran a short item by an Israeli psychiatrist on what I had been proposing, I got an assignment to write it in the fall of 1976 and was actually sent to Canada, to Toronto, to interview a former Miss North Carolina who had moved there because of marriage. I didn't notice anything odd back then about my composure when I was interviewing other second generation members about painful and upsetting things. It was like listening to my mother, listening to them. I thought I was just being professional and taking notes. However, I did find it strange that in waiting for my article to be published in the New York Times magazine back in 1977, I suddenly became uncharacteristically paranoid. I worried that someone would destroy or steal the article. I wondered that I had made the whole thing up, that no one would believe what I had written, and that by writing it, I was betraying family secrets. My father had died at 71, 2 years earlier. He was an old-fashioned man who mourned his murdered parents and brothers till the end of his life. He also kept most of his private life private. I might have stopped pursuing my subject if my father had been alive. As it was, I wound up casting light on a generational shadow. In June of 1977, after 2 million readers of the New York Times Magazine saw an article about second generation on the cover, the article was syndicated around the world. Detaching emotionally was the only way I could cope with the emotional onslaught it unleashed. I was questioned by almost everyone I knew about what I had written. I received hundreds of intimate letters attesting to the shadow of the Holocaust, and I was invited to speak at dozens of libraries, universities, synagogues, and churches. I was an NYU journalism professor in 1977. Anyone could walk into my office unannounced, and some people did. Some people told me I had changed their lives. One guy proposed marriage. Some said they could not relate to what I had written. Some were jealous of me, as though I were a sibling who had gotten more than my share of attention. Some were angry at me for, as they saw it, focusing on trauma and not on triumph, and on airing dirty laundry in public. It was all pretty hard to deal with, and I didn't deal with it well. I zoned out. I had written about what I knew, what we now call trauma and resilience, and instead of people being happy with me, they seemed to have all kinds of weird reactions. That summer of 1977, I was offered a book contract At that time, there was little public discussion of the Holocaust, certainly not about the second generation. The first affiliation groups for children of the Holocaust were created by Eva Fogelman and Bella Savron in Boston in 1976. Members talked about their decimated families, of missing grandparents, aunts, uncles, or cousins, and of parents whose lives had been broken in half. That fall, I joined a newly formed 2G group in Manhattan, modeled on the Vietnam War veteran groups, pioneered by psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton. Its members came from very different backgrounds: religious, not religious, leftist, rightist, gay, straight, but we all bonded while sharing our second generation childhoods. Unlike my one-on-one interviews, in which I encouraged others to express themselves while I kept quiet, here I was expected to speak, and I did. Members of our first group raised subjects that I had not pursued in my interviews, such as sexuality, differences in social class, child abuse, and comparative damage to survivors under Nazism, including really, really bad damage: parents who were unable to work, parents who were unable to function. Two of them had parents who fled Hitler in the late 1930s. The issue of a, quote, hierarchy of suffering during the war surfaced and was uneasily addressed. At least two people in my group described being beaten by their parents. I don't remember whether I said I had been hit. One member accused me of glossing over the shadow of the Holocaust, and particularly the issue of damaged survivors turning their rage onto their children. Rosalie Jarut, now a cantor and a rabbi, joined a group in Boston, but found that its members were so uncomfortable discussing anything negative about survivors that in the 1990s, she spearheaded One by One, a dialogue group for children of survivors and children of Nazis, where she felt safe taking up such subjects. That group is still in existence. I left my group to go write Children of the Holocaust in Toronto. And I spent a year writing as though I were driving through a snowstorm. I could see neither ahead nor behind the sentence I was working on. Despite having published this article in the Times magazine and receiving something like 500 letters, I still doubted that my subject was real. I could not have finished it without the near daily companionship of my interviewee, artist Rochelle Rubinstein in Toronto. Much later, I would understand that my doubting and sense of driving through a snowstorm was my way of describing dissociation, and that I had been employing that psychological defense since early childhood. The stories my parents and their friends told were fascinating, but also scary. I took them in with my ears, but not with my heart or with certain parts of my brain. My brother, Tommy, refused to understand Czech and left the room whenever war talk began, but I stayed. Listening made me feel important, loving, and loved. Being there, but not there, enabled me to listen. I wonder if I learned this psychological trick on my own, or learned it from my mother, who first noticed her dissociation in Auschwitz after she had been tattooed. As she later wrote in her memoir, Francie's War, she had stared at her forearm then, and the forearm became two arms, one that belonged to her and one that belonged to that other woman who looked exactly like her but had a number on her arm. From that moment, she became two people, one who acted and one who watched. Francie had, from the start of the Nazi occupation, refused to identify as a Jew, refused to wear her yellow star, and she continued to run her business, a fashion salon, after it was Aryanized and it was forbidden for Jews to be running a business. She had a nose job after the Nazis invaded Prague to look less Jewish so she could sneak into the movies. She continued to numb out, split, dissociate, whatever one chooses to call it, after the war. Sometimes, as in her suicidal episodes, she threatened to kill herself and then simply ignored what she had said or did not acknowledge that anything unusual had happened. That strategy, of course, affected the rest of her family, particularly me. Sometimes Francie denied realities that reminded her of her wartime experiences, as one summer when I returned from summer camp with a head full of lice. "There are no lice in America," Francie declared. Only after I had produced a live one in my hand did she cut off my long hair and comb it through for nits. She expressed almost nothing in words, no sympathy, no empathy, no acknowledgement. She just did what needed to be done. Growing up with parents who dissociated or may have suffered from alexithymia, not expressing emotions in words, had many consequences. Without a larger extended family, especially grandparents, to model alternatives, I and other sons and daughters of survivors adopted their models of behavior and communication. I was intense, decisive, prolific, and dead serious about most things. I regarded most forms of play as a waste of time, and I was largely unaware, unconscious of fantasy. As a friend and lover, I was loyal, protective, a terrific listener, but not verbally, emotionally expressive. I'm still discovering at age 73 how unusual my expectations around family, separation, boundaries, and loyalty are, especially in a North American context and in my relations with my two adult sons. From an early age, I compared any disappointing or painful thing that happened to me to what had happened to my parents. I was often reminded that pain or disappointment that I experienced, from a bike accident to a heartbreak, was dwarfed by their war, and I never had much sympathy for myself. My parents never used the words disappointing or painful. I learned to use them from the teachers at my son's daycare center. That lack of vocabulary affected my relationships and later my parenting in many ways, some positive, some negative. On the positive side, I've always been aware of being determinedly cheerful, healthy, and counterphobic, in part because my parents told me that as an American child, I could not be any other way. From nursery school through universities, I was acknowledged to be an intrepid leader. One former high schoolmate recently told me that I had reminded her of the Statue of Liberty because I stood tall and seemed unafraid of speaking my mind to anyone. I was also competent in situations of emergency or danger. When my grad school roommate and I were mugged at knife point in our Manhattan apartment, I instructed the muggers on what they should do. I excelled at journalism, where dissociation is almost a prerequisite. Reporters must often detach from feeling and the meaning of their material in order to produce good work. Like other professionals, like doctors, we focus on technique. In our case, accurate observation, choice of words, cadence of sentences, narrative arc, rather than processing emotional content. I still detach at emotionally fraught or dangerous times and process my feelings much, much later. As I've talked to thousands of sons and daughters of survivors all over the world, I've become aware not only of individual dissociation, but of group and national dissociation. Danger, discrimination, and shaming led many in the survivor community to deny, disavow, or minimize their victimization in the war. I found this particularly true in Israel. Czech second-generation members told me how difficult it was to raise children as Jews under totalitarian rule in Czechoslovakia and elsewhere behind the Iron Curtain. They were afraid to live as Jews. They forgot, in quotes, that they were Jews, or their parents never told them. Sons and daughters of French survivors made me aware of what it was like to grow up and walk to school in neighborhoods where roundups and deportations had taken place. In Germany, of course, the past pervades the present, and I found myself, when I was in Germany, aware of adopting a special persona to address the many layers of psychological difficulty. Even in Israel, until very recently, survivor families played down their history. Survivors were marginalized as diaspora Jews and sometimes denigrated as soaps or sheep to the slaughter. I didn't find any of that very consciously problematic until I myself read Children of the Holocaust and absorbed it like an ordinary reader. It was when I reflected on having stored many things in an iron box that I decided I needed therapy. I began in 1979, quit in 1980, started again with a Canadian Son of Survivors therapist in 1981, left in 1982, returned in 2001, and finally worked over the telephone for 8 years, terminating in 2009. My explanation for this also has to do with dissociation. The day before my first session of psychotherapy back in 1979, my mother took me out for lunch and said she was going to save me a lot of time. She was one of the very few Holocaust survivors who herself had undergone psychoanalysis, and so she had some idea of what psychotherapy was like. So she told me that when I was a little girl, she had had an affair with my Czech nanny's husband, and that I had known about it. She explained that he was a non-Jew and anti-Nazi journalist who had been in concentration camps for 6 years. She said that after the war, he had made her feel like a beautiful woman after she had been reduced to a tattooed number by the Nazis. She didn't tell me whether or not my father knew about this. I was, until that time, not too sensitive to the ways in which the Holocaust had influenced intimate issues, such as love and sex. I was also, as you might expect, pretty angry that she had chosen the day before I was going to begin my psychotherapy to spill her beans. Since I keep journals, I wrote down what my mother told me, but then I forgot it. After writing Children of the Holocaust, I hope to put my second generation stuff behind me, as so many people try and fail to do. I wasn't done with the material in the iron box I had opened, but I wanted to be. I wanted to write about other subjects and get out of the shadow of the Holocaust. And I did that. I wrote about the arts. I wrote biographies of artists. Then in 1989, my mother died unexpectedly of a brain aneurysm. She was 69 years old. I was then 41. And as a form of mourning, I tried to write about our complicated relationship. But once again, I chickened out and instead wrote a book about the history of Jewish women up to the time I was born, titled Where She Came From, A Daughter's Search for Her Mother's History. The Shoah, I wrote, had caused a chasm in survivor family histories. There was a before the war and after the war, often separated by a murky during the war. I wanted to bridge that chasm, and I wrote a sequel to Children of the Holocaust that was a family and women's history of Jews in Central Europe. The book ends in 1948, just after I was born. It wasn't until I had traveled many times to what is now the Czech Republic, researched, written, and published where she came from, and after Francie had been dead for 10 years, that I finally began to examine the shadows of my complex relationship with my mother. One thing led to another, and I recovered the memory of what my mother had told me. So at the age of 52, I began writing another Holocaust-related memoir, The Long Half-Lives of Love and Trauma, which took me 15 years to complete. It traces the thread of dissociation that runs through my life, as well as through the lives of many sons and daughters of survivors I've talked to. At 73, I still feel that the Shoah is never far from my consciousness. It colors my thoughts and feelings about nearly everything, from the most personal to the most public events. Last year, I was diagnosed and treated for cancer. My parents' war experience helped me get through it, but also helped me understand through my own body that the word survivor is not owned by the Holocaust community. In 2021, the Holocaust has been contextualized by the recognition and study of medical survivors and survivors of other genocides. Native Americans, Armenians, Cambodians, Rwandans, and others have created their own literature and art out of mass murder. Collective as well as individual trauma has been increasingly made visible by cultural and political changes. Books like Judith Herman's Trauma and Recovery and Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score attest to the widespread recognition of long-term trauma. I've written about Holocaust survivors and their families now for the past 50 years. I'm married to a son of Holocaust survivors, and we have raised our two sons with a consciousness of our history, but we have tried not to force it on them. Now, older than both of my parents when they died, I'm finally ready to step out of the shadow of the Holocaust, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much, Helen, for that very moving and fascinating presentation. You could just tell by all the comments and questions that were coming in as you were speaking that you really touched so many people here who understand exactly what you're talking about and have lots of questions for you. So I'm going to try to get to as many as we can. I want to start with, we have two separate questions that I'm going to push together into one, if that's okay. And it's people who are asking about getting help as second generation. So Sherry writes that she had a particularly bad experience with a Catholic therapist who asked her, "Do you have to be Jewish on day one of therapy?" She says, "What's the best She says, "What's the best way to get therapy as a 2G? If I live in Delaware, I'm on Medicaid and there are no specialists here." But I'd like to sort of wrap that question in with a second person, Karen, who writes, "Why did it take so long for your type of research to trickle down to therapists and patients, even in sophisticated metro areas of the US?" And what I take from those questions is that there still seems to be a chasm to find help and to find community. And that's sort of something that you addressed in part of your words. So I just want to turn it over to you to address those ideas and what you might say to people who are looking for help, whether they're in, a big urban area or somewhere where it might be harder to access.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, thank you for the questions. Those are very good questions. I think in North America, we're much better off than almost anywhere else in the world because both because of the internet and because we do have a very, very large mental health representation of second generation in the psychiatric and medical professions. But what I would urge you to do wherever you are is go online and take a look at what's online. Whatever you may think of Facebook, Facebook has something like 10 or 15 different groups for second generation and third generation members.
Wow.
And if you don't even have to identify yourself, you can just join under a false name if you don't feel like using your own name, and just lurk and see what people talk about and see if it's a group that appeals to you. And if it's a group that appeals to you, join it under your real name and start participating. That's one good idea. Another good idea is to find a second generation group that is near you. If you Google second generation and whatever part of the country you're in, you will find groups near you. I know that there are many groups in Washington, D.C. I know that there are groups in Maryland. I don't know about Delaware, but my guess is there's probably something near you. The third thing you can do is write to psychotherapists or researchers whose work you admire. Now, Eva Fogelman, who happens to be a friend of mine, and she's the person who started the group in Boston in 1976, is still running groups. And in an era of Zoom, you can join these groups from anywhere you are. Eva Fogelman is listed she's on Google, of course, and she's on Facebook, of course, and she is a PhD psychologist working on the Upper West Side, actually around the corner from where I grew up. So she would be one person to get in touch with. Another person, if you're in the Detroit area, it would be Charlie Silo, who's another psychologist who co-founded the group Haim in Detroit. And of course, in Canada, you've got people in Montreal and Toronto and Ottawa, as well as Vancouver.
Thank you for such a great answer. I'm sure that's very helpful for a number of people. We have two questions that came in about third generations, and I'll also wrap those two together. So we had one person who is looking for you to provide some observations about third generations. And then we have a more specific question. What do you think helps third generations heals? What are some of the different avenues?
I actually would refer those questions to Haim, both because I don't know. And secondly, because as the mother of third generation people, it's extremely dangerous for me to say anything about third generation. So Haim, to you.
Sure. Oh, I think you're still muted there. Haim. Yep, you got it.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, I mean,
yes.
I can only particularly speak for myself. I can't speak for other third generations. I think one of the major things is to continue to kind of have these conversations. It's tough. So I remember as a kid, I was going, and I think it will only become tougher. So I remember as a kid, I used to go to the Holocaust Education Symposium and used to hear my Zeta and other Holocaust survivors speak. And so it was an opportunity to kind of hear the story from him and, you know, learn from him and his experiences and his colleagues' experiences, and the opportunity to kind of have the conversation with my father and my family and have that be an option was something that helped me being able to go on the March of the Living and know that there was a community there marching with thousands in Auschwitz. Although it's a very tough and emotional and very draining, you really see the community support there. So I don't think there's a one size fits all. I think knowing that there is support is probably the most important thing, whether that be with your family, whether that be with organizations like CHES or your Jewish day school or your Jewish synagogue, or just other third generations. Facebook is potentially an option. I haven't particularly used that, but I have a lot of family support myself, which I'm incredibly fortunate to have. But these types of events and just generally having family and friends know what's happening and being able to support you when things aren't going so hot. I hope that answered the question. I think the last thing I'll say is just I clearly remember every year when we used to go, there's the Holocaust Remembrance Day at Yom HaShoah, and you go with the candles down the laneway, at least in our shul, and it's just it's very important to see the support is there. And especially nowadays with the pandemic and everything being virtual, it can sometimes be hard to know that there is a supportive community around you. So just making sure people know there's that community and the resources exist. Anyways, I hope that answers it.
Thank you so much for jumping in there. Helen, any wrap-up comments to that question before I
think I probably didn't say explicitly what I think you should do once you get on Facebook or Google, and that is to ask for recommendations of therapists.
Sure. I have a couple of specific questions for you about trauma. The first one, and I'll wrap these two together if you don't mind, is Ms. Epstein, can you say some more about how the varying degrees of, I'm so sorry, my questions are jumping all over the screen. One moment. Can you say some more about how the varying degrees of trauma of survivors, whether they were in Auschwitz or hidden or Kindertransport, how those varying degrees are then carried by second generations if there's an impact? And then the other specific question is, do you find any correlations in the age of survivors from during the war and poor parenting? So some related close questions there.
Well, I can tell you what I've observed. I talked a lot about myself, so let me talk to you about other people I've seen. Lots of people I interviewed focused on their parents, on their survivor parents' attitudes towards the outside world, towards friendships, and towards relationships that led to marriage. And many of them talked about their parents wanting to be on an island with their children and not wanting their children to create meaningful, deep friendships, meaningful, deep relationships with boyfriends, girlfriends, and that was a constant theme in their childhoods as well as in their adulthoods. And that really prevented them from having healthy interpersonal relationships. Another example of that wasn't true of my parents, by the way, but it seems to have been true of many, many survivor families. Another issue was secrecy. You know, not all survivors were in the camps like my parents. A lot of survivors were hidden. And that behavior of hiding as Jews led to behaviors of secrecy and paranoia and duplicity. And in the most extreme cases, it led to survivors coming to North America or South America and basically reestablishing themselves on the new continent as non-Jews. And several of the people I interviewed only discovered that their parents were Jewish Holocaust survivors in their 20s or 30s, or sometimes in their 40s. And that is another pattern that's very interesting. How does this philosophy, life philosophy of secrecy, pass from one generation to another? How do you become aware of it in a family where it's not talked about? More obvious things, such as hoarding or hoarding food or hoarding money. These are also patterns of behavior that have to do with the war. I remember the first time that I went to the Czech Republic, to Czechoslovakia as it was called then, and I met my mother's cousin Kitty. And it was this tiny, tiny apartment. It was still under communist rule. And I just couldn't believe that everywhere I looked, there was all this food hoarded. There was pickles and there was applesauce and there were peaches. And I just could not understand this. Now, part of this was during communism, there were lots of food shortages. But on the other hand, not everybody lived like that. So those are three examples of very specific behaviors that can be learned, that are not epigenetic or neuroscientific, but they are behavioral. And kids watch their parents behave in a certain way, and then they internalize it or they rebel against it.
Thank you. We're having so many questions come in that I'm just trying to stay on top of them, but I just wanted you to know that you've just spurned so much thought and so many questions that it's a great sign. I think we have time for a couple more. I have a question from Eleanor, who says that she is a third generation. She's working on a thesis for her master's in social work, which is on the impact of the intergenerational trauma on second generation as survivors have aged and may need to go into nursing homes. Wondering if you have any thoughts about whether second generation decision making is impacted by the history of their parents.
Absolutely. My experience with this is unfortunately not with the nursing homes, but it was having a mother who had a brain aneurysm. And in my family, it was extremely important to both of my parents to be in control of their manner of death. And of course, when you have a brain aneurysm, you lose all control over how you're going to die because you're in a coma and you can't make any decisions. And I wrote about this actually in the book Where She Came From. It begins with my mother going into a coma and how our family, my two brothers and I, were impacted by our family history and how we dealt with the hospital, how we dealt with trying to protect our mother from the medical system that wanted to keep her alive at all costs, no matter what. And I hope that people who don't believe in humans controlling their own life and death are not offended by this, but we felt we really needed and wanted to respect my mother's wishes. In my father's case, that wasn't an issue because he died of a heart attack. He dropped dead on the street on Riverside Drive. So that was not an issue. But I am aware now of friends who are dealing with the issue of institutionalization, of dementia, of aging survivors. And it's a very, very difficult thing. And I would urge anyone who is having to deal with this to get help from a professional. Jewish
Excellent advice.
Family Services, I know, I don't know if you have it in Canada, but we have it in
Yes, we do.
And they are really, really good. They have senior care people.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and the number one question that's come in a variety of different forms here. I think I've seen it at least half a dozen times, and I'll confess that it was my question too as you wrapped up your presentation is, tell me about this move to come out of the shadow. And the question was sort of iterated in different ways in these chats, but what makes you feel that you're ready to move out of the shadow? What is the definition of moving beyond the shadow for you? And also, do you think it's necessary to move out of the shadow of the Holocaust?
Well, for me, it feels necessary to do it. I don't know, so many people have so many different experiences. One of the criticisms of my work has been that I focused on trauma. There are many people who are descendants of fighters or partisans who feel very proud of their family tradition and don't want to step out of it, want to carry out that tradition of fighting. And that's just not my tradition. That's not where my family came from. So I can't speak to that. But for me, I spent really 50 years writing about this stuff, and I'm done. 50 years is a long time. And I think what really ended it for me was going through my own survival experience of cancer and cancer treatment. Cancer wasn't such a big deal. The treatment was really the survival issue, because to get through the triple whammy of surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation is really a form of survival. And having gone through it, I think I finally said, okay, I have now done this and I deserve some respite. I want to have some years left where I'm not under any shadow, where I'm in the light.
What a beautiful answer.
If you want to read more about this stuff, in my work, probably the best book of mine to read is The Long Half-Lives of Love and Trauma, because in that book, I really describe how psychotherapy worked for me. In my writing, you can read all my writing and you can see, well, sure, I got it all out on paper, so a lot of it isn't inside me anymore. But if you're interested in how psychotherapy helps with this stuff, that's the book to read, The Long Half-Lives of Love and Trauma.
Thank you so much, Ms. Epstein, for all of your wisdoms, your words, your insights, your entire presentation, and also for being so generous with your time and answering questions. And I'll say it again, that you can just tell by the number of questions that came in just how engaging you are and how much people are benefiting from hearing from you tonight. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Well, we are fortunate tonight to have some closing comments from Lawrence Greenspan. Mr. Greenspan has been a human rights lawyer for more than 40 years. He's chaired the JCC, been the Negev honoree, the United Way's Community Builder of the Year, received the Advocate Society Award of Justice, and has been awarded the Order of Ottawa. Welcome to Mr. Greenspan.
Thank you very much. They survived so we could thrive. My close buddy, Trevor, owns a small construction company called Waite Construction. And every time I mention his company, I get a small royalty, but that's not why I mentioned it tonight. You see, Waite stands for Why Am I Doing This? When I was asked by Mina Cohen to speak, I asked myself, as I often do, why am I doing this? Why do I do what I do as a lawyer, as a community participant, and as a Jew? Why was I asked to speak with you this evening? The answer to both questions is my stepfather, my dad, Paul Orlan, who at age 18 and weighing 60 pounds was liberated from Auschwitz by the Americans. My dad lost all of his family, including his parents and his sister, Maja, after whom my daughter is named. I will never forget the look on his face when he first saw Maja number 2 in the hospital. I said lost, and we almost always do. They were murdered, not lost. We lose people to cancer. Those that died in the Holocaust were systemically murdered. My stepfather came into my life when I was only 6. I remember being at my mom and my new dad's wedding at Nanny and Papa's house. I also remember very vividly marching with survivors of Nazi oppression in Montreal in the second row. In the first row were 6 people in concentration camp stripes. My dad and I were next to the Honorable Paul Martin Sr. I was 10. He taught me about the value of getting up on a chair. Get up on a chair, he used to say. If you want to make yourself bigger than the next guy, don't dig a hole for that guy. Later on, he taught me about the importance of checks and balances in order to limit state power over an individual or group's fundamental rights. He knew all too well about the dangers of absolute power. He taught my 2 brothers and I those things to live by and so many other values that we try to live up to. The new anti-Semitism, poorly and politically disguised as anti-Zionism, is no less evil in its intent than the age-old anti-Semitism. And in these times, where the children of those who survived used to say never again, we're living in a world in which anti-Semitism is more widespread and manifest than at any other time in human history. For those who believe in the mantra never again, it is now their children and grandchildren who are called upon on an all too frequent basis to act. And to act means to speak out, to write, to message, to post, to educate, to march, to demonstrate, and support other targets of hate. As Jews, it is heartening to see the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of those who marched arm in arm in Selma in the 50s and the 60s, walking the streets with Black Lives Matter. Only a few days ago on Remembrance Day, we reminded ourselves of the consequences of lest we forget. We cannot afford to relearn what comes with the onset of targeted hatred or with the proliferation of anti-Semitism. I was part of a second-generation group for a few years, and now I'm fortunate to be working with several second-generationers on programs to take place at the National Holocaust Monument here in Ottawa. The second-generation group had been meeting for a few years and decided to get together at a small cottage that I had rented on the Quebec side, as we say. Helen, you would have been in your glory. 15 second-generationers, not even sure that's what you call us, maybe it's 2 Gers, but there we were, 15 of us with collectively 32 university degrees between us. A group of overachievers like you've never seen. And how did we all get there? Well, for some of us, the horrors of the Holocaust were hidden and never spoken of. For others, they were immersed in it by their parents. Their tragedy became their children's burden. They were raised in the never-ending shadow of the Holocaust, the misery of the camps, the guilt of having survived, and the shame. For me and several others, there was a healthy balance. We needed to learn from the stark lessons of the Holocaust. When we asked Dad, he gave us answers that he knew we could understand. As the years went by, the answers became more instructional and life-guiding. So absolutely, we can move outside the shadows and stand in the light. We cannot creep quietly between the shadows, hoping not to be seen. We have all seen the email about the disproportionate number of Jewish Nobel Peace Prize winners, Nobel Prize winners. We need to come out, which, by the way, is very popular these days. We need to come out as Jews. We need to stand up for those who are suffering, stand up for the disadvantaged, and yes, stand up for those who are hated. We need to do this because we know better. We know better than anyone the consequences of ignoring the slings and arrows. We know all too well what happens. What happens, according to Reverend Martin Niemöller, when we fail to stand up until it is too late. Whether it is the courts or the commons or the campuses, whether it is the student court at university or the court of public opinion, which is, by the way, more accessible now than it ever has been, we can all act. We can all move beyond. Is it possible to move beyond its grip? I say yes. Not only is it possible, it is essential to our individual being, and it is essential to our collective continued survival and growth. My dad would have been very proud of this program this evening. He would have liked to participate, and if asked to speak, which is something he did in the public schools, high schools, colleges, and universities in Canada and in the United States. He loved those school visits and believed that education was the strongest way to ensure never again. Thank you to CHES and Mina Cohen for putting together the events and programs of this month. Thank you to Truda Rosenberg, who is an inspiration to generations of the Ottawa community and beyond. Thank you to Haim for your courage in being on the front lines. And it's nothing less than courage to continue to do what you do. And thank you to Helen Epstein for your groundbreaking work and for your voice, which has given voice to generations of survivors and their descendants. Thank you.
Thank you for those very powerful words and for joining us this evening with those beautiful closing thoughts. One reminder for you is that tonight's Eve program, as well as the program from earlier in this month, will be available on CHES's website in a few weeks, so you can look out for that. And before I say goodnight for this evening, we have one more event to tell you about coming up. You can still register for it. That is our program for teachers. It's being held on November 24th. And right now you're seeing our sponsors. So another thank you to those people that made tonight's evening possible. But the final event coming up on November 24th is our program for teachers. And this year we have a fabulous education workshop led by two of our very own CHES members, Sophia Mirzai and Kenra Miraz, who both have rich backgrounds in education. That workshop is called Testimonies of the Holocaust, Inspiring Change Through Legacy, in-depth exploration of the voices of Holocaust survivors. And it's based on testimonies of local survivors recorded by CHES. Thank you so much for spending part of your Sunday evening with us. And one final thank you to all of tonight's speakers and those of you who participated via chat and via questions. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and good night.